Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Chapter 61. Stubb kills a whale. For Starbuck, seeing the squid was a bad omen, but for Queequeg, it meant something entirely different. "When you see the squid," said the savage, sharpening his harpoon at the front of his raised boat, "you'll quickly see the sperm whale too." The next day was extremely still and humid, and with nothing in particular to occupy them, the crew of the Pequod could hardly resist the drowsy pull of the calm sea. This part of the Indian Ocean where we were sailing isn't what whalers call lively. It offers fewer sightings of porpoises, dolphins, flying fish, and other lively sea creatures than areas near the Rio de la Plata or the coastal waters of Peru. It was my turn to stand at the foremast head, and with my back against the slackened royal shrouds, I idly swayed in what felt like an enchanted air. No willpower could hold me back. In that dreamy state, I lost all awareness, and my soul felt like it left my body, while my body continued to sway like a pendulum, long after the force that moved it had disappeared. Just before I completely drifted off, I noticed that the sailors at the main and mizzen mastheads were already dozing off. Eventually, all three of us lazily swung from our perches, and for every swing we made, the sleeping helmsman below nodded in response. The waves, too, nodded lazily, and across the vast, tranquil sea, east nodded to west, with the sun shining down on everything. Suddenly, it felt like bubbles were bursting beneath my closed eyes. My hands gripped the shrouds tightly. Some invisible, benevolent force kept me safe. With a jolt, I came back to reality. And behold, close beside us, not more than 40 fathoms away, a gigantic sperm whale was rolling in the water, looking like a capsized frigate. Its broad, shiny back, dark as an Ethiopian skin, glimmered in the sunlight like a mirror. The whale, lazily undulating in the sea's trough and occasionally blowing out a vaporous jet, resembled a well-fed burgher relaxing with his pipe on a warm afternoon. But that pipe, poor whale, was your last. As if hit by an enchantment, the sleepy ship and everyone in it suddenly came to life. More than 20 voices from all over the vessel, together with the 3 calls from above, shouted the familiar cry as the great fish slowly and rhythmically spouted sparkling seawater into the air. "Clear the boats! Luff!" cried Ahab, and without waiting for the helmsman to take control, he turned the helm sharply. The crew's sudden shouts must have startled the whale, because before the boats were lowered, he majestically turned and swam away to the leeward. But he swam with such steady calmness, making so few ripples, that thinking he might not be frightened yet, Ahab ordered no one to use their oars and to speak only in whispers. Like Ontario Indians perched on the sides of the boats, we paddled swiftly but silently. The calm sea wouldn't allow for the sails to be raised noisily. As we glided in pursuit, the whale suddenly thrust its tail up 40 feet into the air and then vanished beneath the waves like a tower sinking. "There go the flukes," was the cry, immediately followed by Stubb pulling out his match and lighting his pipe, since we now had a moment's respite. After the whale had been under for a while, it resurfaced, this time closer to Stubb's boat than to the others. Stubb was counting on catching it. It was clear now that the whale had finally noticed its pursuers, so the earlier silence was no longer needed. The paddles were dropped and the oars splashed loudly as they went into action. Still puffing on his pipe, Stubb encouraged his crew to charge forward. Yes, a dramatic change had come over the whale. Fully aware of its danger, it was now head out, that part sticking out from the chaotic turbulence it was creating. It will be noted elsewhere how lightweight the entire interior of a sperm whale's enormous head is. Though it seems the most massive, it is actually the most buoyant part, allowing the whale to lift it easily into the air whenever it swims at full speed. Additionally, the shape of the upper part of its head is broad, while the lower part tapers, allowing the whale to transform itself from a sluggish boat into a sharp-pointed New York pilot boat by raising its head. Start her, my men. Don't rush, take your time, but start her like thunderclaps, that's all," cried Stubb, spitting out smoke as he spoke. "Now start. Give them a long, strong stroke, Tashtigo. Start her, Tash, my boy. Start her, everyone, but stay cool, calm as cucumbers. Easy, easy. Just start her like grim death and grinning devils, and raise the buried dead straight out of their graves, boys. That's all. Start her. Woohoo, wahee." screamed the gay-header in response, sending an old war cry skyward as every oarsman in the taut boat instinctively lunged forward with the one massive stroke given by the eager Indian. His wild screams were answered by equally wild cries. "Ki-hee! Ki-hee!" yelled Dagu, straining back and forth on his seat like a pacing tiger in a cage. "Kala! Kulu!" howled Queequeg, as if savoring a mouthful of steak. With oars and yells, the boat sliced through the water. Meanwhile, Stubb stayed in the front, still urging his men on, all the while puffing smoke. They tugged and strained like desperados until the welcome cry rang out. "Stand up, Tashtego! Give it to him!" The harpoon was thrown. Stern all! The oarsmen pulled back. At the same moment, they felt something hot and hissing glide along their wrists. It was the magical line. Just before, Stubb had quickly taken 2 more turns with it around the loggerhead, and now, because of its rapid circling, a blue hempen smoke rose up and mixed with the steady stream from his pipe. As the line went round and round the loggerhead, it also blisteringly passed through both of Stubb's hands, from which the handcloths or quilted pieces of canvas sometimes worn during these times had accidentally fallen. It felt like holding a sharp 2-edged sword by the blade, with that sword constantly trying to escape from your grip. "Wet the line! Wet the line!" cried Stubb to the oarsman at the tub, who, taking off his hat, splashed seawater into it. More turns were taken, so the line began to hold firm. The boat now sped through the boiling water like a shark gliding through the sea. Stubb and Tashtego switched places, front for back, an awkward maneuver in the rocking chaos. To illustrate how important this action is, it should be noted that in the old Dutch fishery, a mop was used to splash seawater onto the running line. On many other ships, a wooden bailer is set aside for this purpose. However, your hat is the most convenient. With the vibrating line stretching across the entire length of the upper part of the boat and now tighter than a harp string, it felt as if the craft had 2 keels, one cutting through the water and the other slicing through the air, as the boat surged through both opposing elements. A constant cascade poured over the bow, creating a swirling eddy in its wake. Even the slightest movement from within, even just a finger, could tip the vibrating, cracking boat overboard. They rushed forward. Each man clung tightly to his seat to avoid being thrown into the foam, and Tashtego crouched low at the steering oar to lower his center of gravity. Whole oceans seemed to pass as they sped along, until the whale gradually slowed down. "Haul in! Haul in!" Stubb called to the bowman. Facing the whale, everyone began pulling the boat closer while it was still being towed. Soon alongside the whale, Stubb firmly planted his knee in the cleat and threw dart after dart into the fish. At the captain's command, the boat alternated between moving out of the way of the whale's terrible wallow and repositioning for another throw. The red tide now flowed from the monster like streams down a hill. Its tormented body rolled, not in salt water, but in blood, bubbling and boiling for miles behind in their wake. The slanting sun shining on this crimson patch of the sea reflected back onto every face, making them all glow like red men. All the while, jets of white smoke shot agonizingly from the whale's blowhole, and Stubb puffed fervently from his pipe. As he pulled the harpoon in with the line attached to it, he straightened it repeatedly with a few quick blows against the gunwale before sending it into the whale again. Pull up, he shouted to the bowman as the exhausted whale slowed down. "Pull up, get close," and the boat glided alongside the fish. Leaning far over the bow, Stubb slowly churned his long, sharp lance into the fish and kept it there, carefully churning as if he was cautiously trying to feel for a gold watch that the whale might have swallowed, afraid of breaking it before he could pull it out. But that gold watch was the whale's innermost life. Now it struck. As the whale jolted out of its stupor into a terrifying frenzy, it rolled in its own blood, wrapping itself in an impenetrable, boiling spray, forcing the boat to drop back and struggle blindly out of that frenzied twilight into the clear daylight. As the whale calmed down, it rolled back into view, surging from side to side and breathing sharply and painfully through its blowhole. Finally, gouts of clotted red blood shot into the air, like the dregs of red wine, before falling back and dripping down its still body into the sea. Its heart had burst. "He's dead, Mr. Stubb," said Dagu. "Yes, both pipes are out." Stubb replied, pulling his pipe from his mouth and scattering the dead ashes over the water. For a moment, he stood there thoughtfully, gazing at the immense corpse he had created. Chapter 62. The Dart. A note about an incident in the last chapter. According to standard practice in whaling, the whaleboat launches from the ship with the headsman, or whale killer, temporarily steering, and the harpooner, or whale fastener, pulling the foremost oar, which is known as the harpooner oar. It requires a strong, agile arm to strike the first iron into the whale. Often, during what is called a long dart, the heavy harpoon has to be thrown up to 20 or 30 feet. However long and exhausting the chase may be, the harpooner is expected to keep pulling his oar with full effort. In fact, he's expected to demonstrate incredible activity, not only by vigorous rowing, but also by shouting loudly and confidently. Only those who have tried it can understand how difficult it is to keep shouting at the top of your lungs while straining every muscle. Personally, I can't yell energetically and work recklessly at the same time. In this exhausting, yelling state, with his back to the whale, the tired harpooner suddenly hears the thrilling call, "Stand up and give it to him." At this moment, he has to drop and secure his oar, turn halfway around, grab his harpoon, and with whatever strength he has left, attempt to throw it at the whale. It's no surprise that, out of 50 good chances to strike, only 5 are successful. It's no wonder so many frustrated harpooners are angrily criticized. It's no wonder some of them actually burst blood vessels in the boat. It's no wonder some sperm whalers are out for 4 years and return with just 4 barrels. It's no wonder that for many ship owners, whaling is a losing business, because it's the harpooner who determines the success of the voyage. And if you exhaust him, how can you expect him to perform when it's most crucial? Moreover, if the dart is successful, at the second critical moment, when the whale starts to run, the boat's leader and the harpooner both rush back and forth, putting themselves and everyone else in danger. It's at this point that they switch places, with the headsman, who is the chief officer of the boat, taking his rightful position at the front. I don't care who argues otherwise. All of this is foolish and unnecessary. The headsman should remain at the front from beginning to end. He should be the one to throw both the harpoon and the lance, and he shouldn't be expected to row at all, except in circumstances obvious to any fisherman. I know this might sometimes slow down the chase a bit, but my long experience with various whaling crews from different nations has convinced me that the main reason for failures in whaling is not the speed of the whale, but the exhaustion of the harpooner. To maximize the chances of a successful strike, harpooners should spring to their feet from rest, not from fatigue. Chapter 63. The Crotch. From the trunk, branches grow. From those branches, twigs emerge. In the same way, chapters develop from productive subjects. The crotch mentioned earlier deserves its own explanation. It's a notched stick about 2 feet long, inserted vertically into the starboard gunwale near the bow. Its purpose is to provide a rest for the wooden end of the harpoon, while the barbed end sticks out from the front of the boat. This makes the harpoon easily accessible for the person using it, who can grab it just as quickly as a frontiersman would grab his rifle off the wall. It's common to have 2 harpoons resting in the crotch, referred to as the first and second irons. Both harpoons are attached to separate lines. The idea is to throw them one after the other into the same whale, so that if one comes loose during the struggle, the other can still hold on. This increases the chances of securing the whale. However, when the whale receives the first iron, it often reacts violently and starts to swim away so quickly that even the fastest harpooner may struggle to throw the second iron. Nevertheless, since the second iron is already attached to a line, it has to be thrown overboard to prevent severe danger for everyone in the boat. When this happens, the spare coils of line, mentioned earlier, usually make it possible to do so safely. But this crucial action doesn't come without serious and often deadly risks. Furthermore, when the second iron is tossed into the water, it becomes a sharp, dangerous threat that flails around the boat and the whale, entangling or cutting lines and causing chaos in all directions. Generally, it's impossible to retrieve it until the whale is caught and dead. Now, imagine the situation when 4 boats are trying to catch one particularly strong, active, and clever whale. Because of its strength and intelligence, along with countless other factors that come into play during such a daring hunt, there could be 8 or 10 loose second irons flailing around it at once. Each boat carries multiple harpoons to attach to the line in case the first one fails to stick. All these details are important to understand because they will clarify some complex and crucial scenes that will come later. Chapter 64. Stubb's Supper. Stubb's whale had been killed some distance from the ship. Since the sea was calm, we lined up 3 boats and began the slow process of towing the whale back to the Pequod. As the 18 of us worked hour after hour, pulling the massive, lifeless body with our 36 arms and 180 fingers and thumbs, the whale barely moved. This slow progress was proof of just how enormous the whale was. In China, 4 or 5 workers can pull a large boat a mile an hour on the Hangzhou Canal, but this great beast seemed to be as heavy as lead. As night fell, 3 lights in the rigging of the Pequod faintly guided us back. When we got closer, we saw Captain Ahab lowering more lanterns over the side of the ship. He looked at the whale for a moment, gave the usual orders to secure it for the night, handed his lantern to a crew member, and went into his cabin, not coming out again until morning. Although Ahab had been energetic while chasing the whale, now that it was dead, he seemed vaguely unsatisfied, impatient, or even despairing. It was as if seeing the dead whale reminded him that Moby Dick was still alive, and no matter how many whales they caught, it wouldn't bring him any closer to his goal of killing that one great whale. Soon, the sounds of heavy chains dragging across the deck made it seem like the crew was preparing to drop anchor. But those chains were meant to secure the whale, not the ship. The whale was tied by the head to the stern and by the tail to the bow, its dark body lying close to the side of the ship. In the darkness, the whale and the ship seemed like 2 massive oxen, one lying down and the other standing. Here's a small detail worth mentioning. The strongest and most secure way to tie a whale to a ship is by its tail, or flukes. Since the tail is heavier and sinks lower than other parts of the whale, it's difficult to reach from the boat to attach the chain. But this problem is cleverly solved. A strong, small line with a wooden float at one end and a weight in the middle is tied to the ship. With some skill, the float is made to rise on the other side of the whale, allowing the chain to follow and be secured around the narrowest part of the tail where it connects to the broad flukes. While Ahab was quiet, at least as far as anyone on deck could tell, Stubb, the second mate, was filled with excitement after the successful hunt. His unusual energy was so noticeable that Starbuck, his superior, let him take charge for a while. One reason for Stubb's good mood became clear soon enough. He had a fondness for whale meat. A steak before I sleep. Daggoo, get overboard and cut me a piece from his back. It's worth mentioning that although these wild fishermen don't usually make their enemies pay for the cost of the war, at least not until after they've made their profit, some Nantucketers really enjoy eating a particular part of the sperm whale that Stubb had requested, the tapered end of the body. Around midnight, that steak was cut and cooked. Lit by 2 lanterns of sperm oil, Stubb stood proudly at the capstan, as if it were his dining table, enjoying his meal. But Stubb wasn't the only one eating whale that night. Thousands of sharks were feasting on the dead whale as well, their feeding frenzy creating a loud noise. The few crew members sleeping below were startled by the slapping of shark tails against the ship's hull, just inches from their hearts. If you looked over the side of the ship, you could just make out the sharks in the dark waters, flipping onto their backs as they tore huge chunks of flesh from the whale, each piece the size of a human head. The way sharks managed to bite out such perfectly round chunks of blubber from the whale's tough skin is nearly miraculous, leaving marks that look like countersinks made by a carpenter for screws. Even in the middle of a sea battle, sharks can be seen looking up at the deck like hungry dogs around a table where meat is being carved, ready to devour any dead sailors thrown their way. While the men on deck carve into each other with their weapons, the sharks below are doing the same with the dead bodies. Sharks also follow slave ships crossing the Atlantic, ready to dispose of any bodies thrown overboard. Though there are other times when sharks gather to feast, no occasion brings them together in greater numbers or with more enthusiasm than a dead sperm whale moored to a ship at night. If you've never seen this, don't be too quick to judge devil worship or attempts to appease evil. But Stubb was too focused on his meal to notice the sharks feasting nearby, just as the sharks didn't care about the sound of Stubb enjoying his supper. "Cook, where's that old fleece?" Stubb called out, widening his stance as if to steady himself, while stabbing at his dish like he was harpooning a whale. "Cook, come here." The old black cook, not very happy about being woken up from his cozy hammock at such an unreasonable hour, shuffled over from his galley. Like many older black men, he had some issues with his knees, which he didn't keep as clean as his other pots. This old man, called Fleece, limped along, using his tongs, awkwardly made from straightened iron hoops, to help him walk. He came to a stop on the opposite side of Stubb's makeshift table. With his hands folded in front of him and resting on his two-legged cane, he bent his arched back even further while tilting his head to listen better. "Cook," said Stubb, quickly bringing a reddish piece of meat to his mouth. "Don't you think this steak is a bit overcooked? You've beaten it too much. It's too tender. Don't I always say a whale steak should be tough to be good? Look at those sharks over the side. They prefer it tough and rare. What a ruckus they're making. Cook, go talk to them. Tell them they can help themselves politely and in moderation, but they have to keep it down. I can't hear my own voice. Go on, cook, and deliver my message." "Here, take this lantern," he said, grabbing one from his makeshift table. "Now go and preach to them." Grumpily accepting the lantern, Old Fleece limped across the deck to the rail. Holding the light low over the sea to see the sharks better, he waved his tongs in one hand and leaned over the side, mumbling to address the sharks, while Stubb quietly followed behind and listened. "Hey, fellow creatures, I'm here to tell you to stop that damn noise. You hear? Stop that damn smacking of your lips. Master Stubb says you can fill your damn bellies, but by God, you have to stop that racket." "Cook," Stubb interrupted, giving him a playful slap on the shoulder. "You can't swear like that while you're preaching. That's no way to convert sinners." "Who's that?" "Then preach to him yourself," Fleece replied sulkily, turning to leave. "No, Cook, keep going." "Well then, beloved fellow creatures, right," Stubb exclaimed approvingly. "Coax them. Try that," and Fleece continued. "You're all sharks and by nature very greedy, but I say to you fellow creatures, that greed, stop that damn tail slapping. How do you expect to hear if you keep up that damn slapping and biting?" "Cook," Stubb said, grabbing him again, "I won't have you swearing. Talk to them nicely." Once more, Fleece resumed his sermon. "I don't blame you for being greedy, fellow creatures. That's nature, and you can't help it. But controlling that wicked nature is the key. You are sharks, sure, but if you can control the shark in you, then you can be angels, because all an angel is a well-controlled shark. Now, listen, brothers, just try to be civil and help yourselves from that whale. Don't tear the blubber out of your neighbor's mouth, I say. Is one shark any better than another when it comes to that whale? And by God, none of you has the right to that whale. It belongs to someone else. I know some of you have big mouths, bigger than others, but big mouths sometimes have small stomachs. So being big doesn't mean you should eat up all the blubber for the little sharks that can't get in to help themselves." "Well done, Old Fleece," cried Stubb. "That's Christianity. Keep going." "No use going on. Those damn gluttons will just keep pushing and slapping each other, Master Stubb. They won't hear a word from me. No use preaching to such damn gluttons until their bellies are full, and their bellies are bottomless. And when they do get full, they'll sink in the sea, go fast asleep on the coral, and won't hear anything at all, ever again. Honestly, I think I'm starting to agree with you. So give the benediction, Fleece, and I'll head to my supper." With that, Fleece raised his hands over the fishy crowd, raised his voice, and shouted, "Cursed fellow creatures, make the biggest ruckus you can, fill your damn bellies till they burst, and then die." "Now, Cook," said Stubb, going back to his supper at the capstan, "stand just where you were before, over there against me, and pay close attention." "All right," said Fleece, again stooping over the tongs as Stubb requested. "Well," Stubb said while serving himself, "let's get back to the subject of this steak. First of all, how old are you, Cook?" What does that have to do with the steak? The old man grumbled. Silence! How old are you, cook? About 90, they say, he muttered gloomily. And you've lived in this world for almost 100 years, cook, and you still don't know how to cook a whale steak. He quickly shoved another piece in his mouth so that it sounded like part of the question. Where were you born, cook? Behind the hatchway, in a ferry boat, going over the Roanoke. Born in a ferry boat, that's strange too, but I want to know what country you were born in, cook. Didn't I say the Roanoke country? He snapped. No, you didn't, cook. But here's what I'm getting at. You need to go home and be born again. You still don't know how to cook a whale steak. Bless my soul if I cook another one, he grumbled angrily, turning to leave. Come back, cook. Here, give me those tongues. Now take that piece of steak and tell me if you think it's cooked right. Take it, I say. Holding the tongs out to him, take it and taste it. Faintly smacking his dry lips over it for a moment, the old man muttered, Best cooked steak I ever tasted. Juicy, very juicy. Cook, said Stubb, straightening himself again, do you belong to a church? I passed one once in Cape Town, the old man replied sullenly. So you've passed a holy church in Cape Town, where you probably heard a holy preacher addressing his listeners as his beloved fellow creatures, and yet you come here and tell me such a horrible lie as you did just now, huh? Stubb said. Where do you expect to go when you die, cook? Go to bed very soon, he mumbled, half turning as he spoke. Stop, heave to. I mean, when you die, cook. It's an important question. What's your answer? When this old black man dies, the cook said slowly, changing his tone and demeanor, he himself won't go anywhere, but some blessed angel will come and take him. Take him? How? In a coach and four like they took Elijah? And take him where? Up there, Fleece said, holding his tongues straight above his head, keeping them there solemnly. So, you expect to go up into our main top when you die, do you, cook? But don't you know the higher you climb, the colder it gets? Main top, huh? I didn't say that at all, Fleece replied, sulking again. You said up there, didn't you? Now look where your tongues are pointing. But maybe you think you can get into heaven by crawling through the lubber's hole. Cook! No, cook! You don't get there unless you go the regular way, round by the rigging. It's a tricky business, but it must be done, or else it's no good. But none of us are in heaven yet. Drop your tongs, cook, and listen to my orders. Do you hear me? Hold your hat in one hand and put the other hand over your heart while I'm giving my orders. Cook. What? Is that your heart there? That's your gizzard. Up high. That's it. Now you have it. Keep it there and pay attention. All right, said the old man with both hands in position, trying to wiggle his grizzled head to get both ears in front at once. Well then, cook. You see, this whale steak of yours was so badly cooked that I've put it out of sight as fast as possible. You see that, don't you? Well, for the future, when you cook another whale steak for my private table here at the capstan, here's what you need to do to avoid ruining it by overcooking. Hold the steak in one hand and show a live coal to it with the other, then dish it. Got it? And now tomorrow, cook. When we're cutting into the fish, be sure to stand by to get the tips of its fins. Have them put in pickle. As for the ends of the flukes, have them soaked. Cook. There, you can go now. But Fleece had hardly taken 3 steps away when he was called back. Cook, give me cutlets for supper tomorrow night during the mid-watch. Do you hear? Off you go then. Wait, bow before you leave. Stop again. Whale balls for breakfast. Don't forget. Wish, by God, that whale would eat him instead of him eating the whale. I'm blessed if he's not more of a shark than Master Shark himself, the old man muttered as he limped away. With that wise remark, he went back to his hammock. Chapter 65. The Whale as a Dish. It seems pretty bizarre that a human should eat the creature that fuels his lamp and, like Stubb, consume it by its own light. To understand this unusual situation, we need to delve a bit into its history and philosophy. Records show that 3 centuries ago, the tongue of the right whale was considered a delicacy in France and commanded high prices there. Additionally, during the time of Henry VIII, a royal cook received a generous reward for creating an amazing sauce to accompany barbecued porpoises, which, as you know, are a type of whale. Even today, porpoises are viewed as tasty food. Their meat is shaped into balls about the size of billiard balls, and when seasoned well, could easily be mistaken for turtle or veal balls. The old monks of Dunfermline loved them, thanks to a generous porpoise grant from the crown. The truth is that among whale hunters, the whale would be regarded as a great dish if there weren't so much of it. When faced with a meat pie nearly 100 feet long, your appetite quickly vanishes. Nowadays, only the most open-minded individuals like Stubb will partake in cooked whale. But the Eskimos are less picky. We all know how they rely on whales for food and have rare, vintage supplies of high-quality whale oil. Zogranda, a well-known doctor among them, recommends blubber strips for infants, as they are incredibly juicy and nourishing. This brings to mind certain Englishmen who were accidentally left in Greenland by a whaling ship. They lived for several months on the moldy scraps of whales left on the shore after the blubber was processed. Among Dutch whalers, these scraps are called fritters, and they resemble brown, crisp treats that smell somewhat like the donuts made by housewives in Old Amsterdam. They look so edible that even the most disciplined stranger can hardly resist them. What further diminishes the whale's appeal as a civilized dish is its overwhelming richness. It's like the grand prize ox of the sea, too fatty to be delicately enjoyable. Just look at its hump, which could be as tasty as buffalo, which is considered a rare treat if it weren't such a solid mound of fat. And as for spermaceti, it's so bland and creamy, it's like the translucent, half-jellied white meat of a coconut in its 3rd month of growth, but it's far too rich to be used as a butter substitute. Still, many whalers find ways to absorb it into other foods and enjoy it. During long night watches, it's common for sailors to dip their ship biscuits into large pots of oil and let them fry for a while. I've had many good meals that way. In the case of a small sperm whale, the brains are considered a delicacy. The skull is broken open with an axe, and the 2 plump, whitish lobes, resembling 2 large puddings, are mixed with flour and cooked into a delicious dish that tastes somewhat like calf's head, which is quite a treat for some food enthusiasts. Everyone knows that some young foodies who regularly dine on calves' brains eventually develop a bit of their own intelligence, allowing them to distinguish a calf's head from their own. That takes a discerning palate. And that's why a young foodie with an intelligent-looking calf's head in front of them is one of the saddest sights you can witness. The head seems to look reproachfully at them, as if saying, "Et tu, brute." Perhaps the reason landsmen find eating whale so distasteful is partly because of its excessive richness. It also seems to stem from the idea that a person is consuming a freshly killed sea creature, and doing so by its own light. But surely, the first person to ever kill an ox was viewed as a murderer. He might have been hanged, and if he were tried by a group of oxen, he certainly would have been, and he would have deserved it as much as any murderer does. Go to the meat market on a Saturday night and watch the crowds of people gazing up at the long rows of dead animals. Doesn't that sight make a cannibal rethink their choices? Cannibals? Who isn't a cannibal? I'll tell you this, it will be more bearable for the Fiji man who salted away a lean missionary in his cellar for a future famine than for you, civilized and refined gourmet, who nails geese to the ground and feasts on their fatty livers in your pâté de foie gras. But Stubb, he eats the whale by its own light, right? That's just adding insult to injury, isn't it? Look at your knife handle there. My cultured and refined foodie dining on that roast beef. What's that handle made of? The bones of the very ox you're eating. And what do you use to pick your teeth after devouring that fat goose? A feather from the same bird. And with what quill did the secretary of the Society for the Suppression of Cruelty to Ganders write his letters? Just recently, that society decided to only use steel pens. Chapter 66. The Shark Massacre. When a captured sperm whale is finally brought alongside the ship during the southern fishery after a long and exhausting effort, it's generally not the custom to start cutting it right away, at least not immediately. This task is incredibly labor-intensive, takes a long time to finish, and requires everyone on deck to help. So the usual practice is to take in all the sails, secure the helm, and then send everyone below to their hammocks until dawn. However, it's important to keep anchor watches during this time, meaning that pairs of crew members will take turns checking on things for an hour each to ensure everything is all right. Sometimes, especially near the equator in the Pacific, this approach doesn't work at all. Huge numbers of sharks can gather around the moored carcass, and if left unattended for 6 hours, only the skeleton would likely be visible by morning. In most other ocean areas, where sharks are less abundant, their incredible hunger can sometimes be reduced by vigorously poking them with sharp whaling spades. Yet, in some cases, this only seems to excite them even more. However, this was not the case with the sharks around the Pequod. Any man not used to such sights would have thought that the entire sea was one giant cheese, with those sharks acting like maggots crawling through it. Nevertheless, when Stubb started the anchor watch after finishing his supper, and when Queequeg and another crew member came on deck, the excitement among the sharks was palpable. They immediately set up cutting stages over the side and lowered 3 lanterns to cast bright beams of light over the murky water. The 2 sailors, armed with their long whaling spades, relentlessly hunted the sharks by driving the sharp steel deep into their skulls, which seemed to be the only vital part. However, in the chaotic swirling of the struggling sharks, the marksmen didn't always hit their targets, revealing the incredible ferocity of their adversaries. The sharks not only snapped at each other's guts, but also twisted around to bite themselves. It seemed like they were swallowing their own entrails, only to expel them again from their gaping wounds. But that wasn't all. It was dangerous to interfere with the bodies and remnants of these creatures. A kind of lingering vitality seemed to dwell in their joints and bones, even after what could be called their individual life had ended. One of the sharks, which had been killed and brought on board for its skin, nearly took off Queequeg's hand when he tried to close the lifeless mouth of its deadly jaws. The whaling spade used for cutting the whale is made from high-quality steel and is about the size of a man's open hand. It resembles a garden tool, but its sides are completely flat, and the top is narrower than the bottom. This weapon is always kept razor sharp, and it's often honed while in use, just like a razor. A stiff pole, typically 20 to 30 feet long, is inserted into its socket to serve as a handle. Queequeg doesn't care what god made him a shark, the savage said, painfully lifting his hand up and down. Whether it's a Fiji god or a Nantucket god, the god that made sharks must be one damn Indian. Chapter 67. Cutting in. It was a Saturday night, and what a Sabbath it was. All whalemen are notorious for breaking the Sabbath. The ivory Pequod looked like a slaughterhouse, with every sailor acting like a butcher. You would have thought we were offering up 10,000 red oxen to the sea gods. First, the massive cutting tackles, along with other heavy equipment that no single man could lift, were hoisted up to the main top and securely tied to the lower masthead, the strongest point above the ship's deck. The end of the thick rope winding through these blocks was then led to the windlass, and the large lower block of the tackles was swung over the whale. To this block, a heavy blubber hook weighing around 100 pounds was attached. Now, suspended from the side of the ship, Starbuck and Stubb, the first mates, armed with their long spades, began cutting a hole in the whale's body just above the nearest of its 2 side fins. Once they made the initial cut, they created a broad, semicircular line around the hole, inserted the hook, and the main crew began singing a wild chorus as they all pulled together at the windlass. Suddenly, the entire ship leaned over to one side. Every bolt creaked like the nails of an old house in cold weather. She shivered, shook, and tilted her frightened mastheads toward the sky. As she leaned further over the whale, every gasp of the windlass was met with a wave from the sea, until finally a sharp snap echoed, and with a great surge, the ship rolled upwards and backwards from the whale, with the triumphant tackle rising into view, dragging along the semicircular end of the first strip of blubber. The blubber surrounds the whale just like the rind does an orange, and it is peeled off in much the same way, often spiraled off. The constant strain from the windlass keeps the whale rolling in the water, and as the blubber peels off along the line called the scarf, which is cut by Starbuck and Stubb's spades, it is continuously lifted higher and higher until its upper end brushes against the main top. The men at the windlass then stop pulling for a moment, and the massive, blood-dripping mass sways back and forth as if it were being lowered from the sky. Everyone present has to be careful to dodge it when it swings, or it might knock them overboard. One of the harpooneers steps up with a long, sharp tool called a boarding sword. Timing his move just right, he skillfully slices out a sizable hole in the lower part of the swaying mass. He then hooks the end of the second tackle into this hole to secure the blubber for what comes next. After warning everyone to stay clear, this expert swordsman takes a few quick, desperate slices and completely cuts the mass in half. While the shorter lower part remains attached, the longer upper strip, known as a blanket piece, swings free and is ready to be lowered. The crew at the windlass resumes their song, and while one tackle is peeling and lifting a second strip from the whale, the other is slowly loosened, sending the first strip down through the main hatch into an empty room called the blubber room. In this dimly lit space, various nimble hands quickly coil the long blanket piece as if it were a huge, live mass of braided snakes. The work continues. The two tackles hoisting and lowering simultaneously, both the whale and the windlass heaving, the crew singing, the blubber room workers coiling, the mates scarfing, the ship straining, and everyone occasionally swearing to relieve the tension of the work. Chapter 68. The Blanket. I've spent a lot of time thinking about the often debated topic of a whale's skin. I've had discussions about it with experienced whalers at sea and knowledgeable naturalists on land. My original opinion hasn't changed, but it's still just an opinion. So, what exactly is the skin of a whale, and where is it located? You already know what blubber is. Blubber has a texture similar to firm, well-marbled beef, but it's tougher, more elastic, and more compact, with thickness ranging from 8 to 15 inches. While it may seem strange to think of an animal's skin being that thick, there's no argument against it, because the only thick layer you can find on a whale's body is that blubber. The outermost covering of any animal is typically its skin, so what else could it be? You can scrape off a thin, transparent layer from the surface of a whale's body, which resembles the thinnest pieces of isinglass. This layer is flexible and soft like satin, but once it dries, it contracts and hardens, becoming brittle. I have several dried pieces of it that I use as bookmarks in my whale books. It's transparent, and when laid over a printed page, I sometimes like to imagine it magnifies the text. It's amusing to read about whales through their own spectacles. However, what I'm really getting at is that this thin, isinglass-like layer covering the whale isn't so much the whale's actual skin, but rather a skin of the skin. It would be absurd to claim that the real skin of such a massive creature is thinner and more delicate than that of a newborn baby. But let's move on. If we assume the blubber is the skin of the whale, then in the case of a large sperm whale, this skin can yield around 100 barrels of oil. Considering that, in terms of weight, that oil only makes up 3/4 of the total substance of the whale's outer layer. It gives us an idea of the enormous size of the whale, as just a part of its outer covering can produce such a vast quantity of liquid. If you calculate that 10 barrels equal 1 ton, that means you have 10 tons for the net weight of just 3/4 of the whale's skin. When alive, the surface of a sperm whale is among the many marvels it presents. It is usually covered with numerous straight lines that crisscross each other, resembling fine Italian engravings. These lines don't appear to be impressed on the isinglass-like substance. Rather, they seem to be etched directly into the whale's body. Moreover, to the keen observer, these linear marks serve as the basis for even more complex designs. These can be thought of as hieroglyphics. If you refer to the mysterious symbols on the walls of ancient pyramids as hieroglyphics, then that's the term to use here. I remember one sperm whale particularly well, which had markings that reminded me of the ancient symbols carved into the famous palisades along the upper Mississippi. Like those mystical rocks, the whale with these markings remains undecipherable. This comparison to the Indian rocks brings another thought to mind. Besides the other features of the sperm whale's exterior, it often displays its back and flanks, which show a variety of random scratches that interrupt the regular linear patterns. I would say that the coastal rocks of New England, which Agassiz believes bear the marks of violent scraping from massive icebergs, must resemble the sperm whale in this regard. It seems likely that these scratches on the whale are made by encounters with other whales, as I've noticed them most often on the large, mature males of the species. A couple more points about the whale's skin or blubber. It is removed in long strips known as blanket pieces. This term is very fitting, as the whale is indeed wrapped in its blubber like a blanket or a poncho covering its body. This cozy layer allows the whale to stay warm in all kinds of weather and sea conditions. Just imagine what would happen to a Greenland whale in the freezing, icy waters of the north if it didn't have its insulating layer. Other fish can thrive in those frigid waters, but they are cold-blooded creatures, almost like refrigerators themselves. They warm up by hiding under an iceberg, similar to how a traveler would sit by a fire in winter. In contrast, like humans, whales have lungs and warm blood. If their blood freezes, they die. So it's remarkable, if not entirely explainable, that this giant creature, for whom maintaining body warmth is just as vital as it is for us, can thrive in those Arctic waters. In fact, when sailors fall overboard in those conditions, they can sometimes be found months later frozen in the ice, just like a fly trapped in amber. More astonishing is the fact that experiments have shown that the blood of a polar whale is warmer than that of a Borneo native in the summer. It seems to me that this demonstrates a unique combination of strong individual vitality, thick layers of protection, and spacious interiors. Oh, man! Admire and model yourself after the whale. Stay warm in the ice. Live in this world without being completely of it. Keep cool at the equator and maintain a steady temperature in the polar regions. Just like the Grand Dome of St. Peter's Basilica, and like the great whale, maintain your own temperature in all seasons. But how easy it is to say these things, and how impossible to teach them. Of buildings, how few are domed like St. Peter's. Of creatures, how few are as vast as the whale. Chapter 69. The Funeral. Haul in the chains. Let the carcass drift behind. The massive rigging has now done its job. The white, stripped body of the beheaded whale shines like a marble tomb. Even though its color has changed, it hasn't noticeably lost any size. It's still enormous. Slowly, it floats further away, the water around it disturbed and splashed by hungry sharks, while above it, the air is filled with the frantic flapping of seagulls, whose beaks resemble sharp daggers attacking the whale. The vast white, headless figure drifts further from the ship, and with every yard it moves, more and more sharks and seabirds gather around it, creating a deafening cacophony. For hours, this horrific scene is visible from the nearly motionless ship. Under the clear, gentle blue sky, and on the calm surface of the pleasant sea, driven by the cheerful breeze, that massive mass of death floats on until it fades into the distance. What a mournful and mocking funeral this is. The sea vultures mourn piously, and the seagulls are dressed in their black and speckled feathers. In life, few of these birds would have helped the whale if it had needed it, yet at its funeral feast, they pounce with reverence. Oh, the horrible opportunism of nature. Even the mightiest whale isn't free from it. But this isn't the end. Even though the whale's body has been disrespected, a vengeful ghost lingers above it to haunt. Spotted from a distance by a cautious naval ship or a clumsy exploration vessel, when the crowding birds obscure the view, the whale's white mass can still be seen floating in the sun, with white spray rising against it. Immediately, the whale's harmless corpse is recorded in the log with trembling hands. Beware of shoals, rocks, and breakers in this area. And for years afterward, ships might avoid this place, jumping over it like foolish sheep leap over an empty space because their leader once jumped there when a stick was held up. There's your law of precedence. There's your reliance on traditions. There's the story of how old beliefs stubbornly survive without any real basis on the ground, and now not even floating in the air. There's orthodoxy. Thus, while the great whale's body might have been a real threat to its enemies when alive, in death, its ghost becomes a powerless source of fear for the world. Are you a believer in ghosts, my friend? There are more kinds of ghosts than just the famous one from Cock Lane, and there are far more profound thinkers than Dr. Johnson who believe in them. Chapter 70. The Sphynx. It's important to note that before completely stripping the Leviathan's body, it was beheaded. Beheading a sperm whale is a complex surgical procedure that experienced whalers take great pride in, and with good reason. Consider that the whale doesn't really have a neck. In fact, the thickest part of its body is where the head connects to the torso. Remember that the surgeon has to work from above, about 8 to 10 feet away from the whale, which is often hidden in a discolored, turbulent sea. Keep in mind that, under these challenging conditions, the surgeon has to cut several feet deep into the flesh without being able to see the gash he's making, and he must carefully avoid all the nearby parts while precisely cutting the spine at a critical point near where it connects to the skull. Doesn't it amaze you that Stubb claimed he could behead a sperm whale in just 10 minutes? Once severed, the head is dropped behind the ship and held there with a cable until the body is stripped. After that, if it's a small whale, the head is brought onto the deck for disposal. However, with a fully grown leviathan, this isn't possible. The sperm whale's head accounts for nearly 1/3 of its total mass, and trying to lift such a weight, even with the huge tackle of a whaling ship, would be as pointless as trying to weigh a Dutch barn with a jeweler's scale. With the whale decapitated and the body stripped, the head was hoisted against the ship's side, about halfway out of the water, so it could still be buoyed up by the sea. With the ship leaning steeply over due to the heavy downward pull from the mast, and every yardarm on that side extending like a crane over the waves, the blood-dripping head hung from the Pequod like the giant Holoferneses from Judith's girdle. When this final task was finished, it was noon, and the crew went below for their dinner. Silence fell over the once bustling deck. An intense calm, like a vast yellow lotus, was slowly unfolding its silent, limitless petals on the sea. A short time later, Ahab came up from his cabin into the stillness. After taking a few turns on the quarterdeck, he paused to look over the side. Then, slowly climbing into the main chains, he grabbed Stubb's long spade, which was still there after the whale's decapitation. He struck the blade into the lower part of the half-suspended head, wedging the other end under his arm, and leaned over to fix his gaze on it. It was a black, hooded head, and hanging there in the midst of such deep calm, it resembled the Sphynx in the desert. "Speak, you vast and ancient head," muttered Ahab, which, though lacking a beard, still shows signs of age with patches of moss. "Speak, mighty head, and tell us the secret that lies within you. Of all divers you have dived the deepest. That head upon which the sun now shines has been among the world's foundations, where unrecorded names and ships rust, and untold hopes and anchors decay, where this murderous earth is filled with the bones of millions who drowned. In that dreadful underwater realm, you were most at home. You've been where no bell or diver has ever gone. You've rested beside many a sailor, while sleepless mothers would give anything to have them back. You saw the locked lovers leap from their burning ship. Heart to heart, they sank beneath the triumphant waves, true to each other, when heaven seemed false. You witnessed the murdered mate tossed overboard by pirates from the midnight deck. For hours he fell into the deeper darkness of the insatiable maw, while his murderers sailed on unharmed as fierce lightning struck the nearby ship that would have carried a righteous husband to his waiting arms. O head, you've seen enough to shatter worlds and make an infidel of Abraham, yet not a single word escapes your lips. "Sail, ho!" shouted a triumphant voice from the crow's nest. "Oh, well, that's encouraging," Ahab exclaimed, suddenly standing up as the storm clouds seemed to clear from his brow. That lively cry breaking this deadly calm might almost inspire a better man. Where away? 3 points on the starboard bow, sir, and she's bringing her breeze to us. Better and better. Would that St. Paul would come that way and bring his wind to my sails. O nature and O soul of man, how far beyond words are your linked analogies. Not a single atom stirs or lives in matter without having its clever counterpart in the mind.